Into Robert Jordan. He was the US ambassador to Saudi Arabia between 2001 and 2003. He's also the author of Desert Diplomat, Inside Saudi Arabia Following 9/11. Ambassador Jordan, thanks a lot for joining us. You've been in this region a lot. We know that these two countries have had their diplomatic rifts before. In your experience, how serious is this? Where does this stack up among all their other disputes?
Well, it's not at the top, but I think it's something we need to continue to monitor very closely. You know, seemingly innocuous events can sometimes come unhinged through misplaying one's hand, through overplaying one's hand. We saw this at the beginning of World War I with the Zimmerman telegram and the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand. So I think we've got to keep an eye on this and be sure that neither side overplays their hand. I think steady advice from the U.S., the Russians, Turkey, and perhaps even Oman can be helpful in this.
Ambassador Jordan, it's Nathan King here on set. I want to ask you, where do you see this ending? What's the out here in terms of Saudi Arabia and Iran? There's a lot at stake, as you said, and both sides have to be very, very careful here, given the religious tensions too.
Well, it's religious and it's also ethnic in terms of Arab versus Persian. And so I think we've got to keep an eye on the two main proxy wars that are going on in Yemen and Syria. If they can actually hold their noses and manage to sit down at the same table and negotiate some sort of transitional peace in Syria, I think that will go a long way toward de-escalating the issue. The Saudis are adamant that Bashar al-Assad has to go. I think that has compromised their willingness to help us fight ISIS up to this point. So that's a really key issue. Then, of course, in Yemen, the Saudis have not really articulated a political objective. My guess is they'd simply like to wipe out the Houthis, but that's not in the cards. The Houthis represent about 30% of that population. So they're going to have to find a way to find a political solution with the Houthis, and Iran is going to have to find a way to be satisfied with what that is. That's a pretty tall order.
Ambassador, some Iranian officials were saying today that they think Saudi Arabia is the biggest loser in this because Iran exports more food than it imports oil from Saudi Arabia. Do you agree with that?
Well, I don't think the win or loss is on an economic level right now. I think a lot of it's political. And also the Saudis, I think by some of their actions, are trying to play to a domestic audience. And so they may be winning more from a domestic audience than they do economically or abroad. And they've also managed to rally all of the Sunni Arab countries to speak of in the region, which I think is a diplomatic plus for them.
Just going back to Iran, Ambassador, as Nathan was saying, this country is emerging from these sanctions after all these years. Does this play into that in any way? Saudi Arabia is obviously a key ally of countries like the US. Is the US going to have to pick a side in all this once again?
Well, the U.S. can't really end up picking Iran at this point. Iran is still a revolutionary state. It's still a state sponsor of terrorism. The United States is not going to pick Iran at this stage. We've had an alliance with Saudi Arabia for over 70 years. The Saudis have done almost everything we've asked them to do up to this point as an ally, even though they didn't believe in some of what we were doing. So I think that we're going to have to stick with the Saudis, as imperfect an ally as they are. Iran, though, I think has some areas of concern. They've been trying to come into the family of nations. They have announced they're going to be applying for membership in the World Trade Organization, the WTO. I think that application would be dead on arrival right now, given the way the violence has unfolded just recently.
Ambassador, you came up with a really good point, I thought, just before, about how Saudi Arabia might be playing to a domestic audience. Iran, of course, has its domestic audience too.
Right.
How much of the low oil prices and the financial crisis that is actually hitting Saudi and others in the region fuels this sort of nationalist sentiment? Because now we're seeing Saudi Arabia, for example, cut back on the generous benefits it has given its citizens for generations.
You're exactly right, and that's a point I've been making today with some media discussions. The Saudis are cutting back the enormous subsidies. There's also talk they might even institute a value-added tax or even an income tax. All of this is going to hit every single Saudi in the pocketbook significantly. And so I think in preparation for what will be a very sour reaction to those measures, the Saudis are trying to puff up the nationalist spirit. They're also trying to show that they will not tolerate dissent. And I think that was behind some of these executions as well.
Final word, Ambassador. In a nutshell, how serious is this for the region, given everything else that is happening in the Middle East right now?
Well, just when you think it can't get worse in the Middle East, it does. And I would say this is probably a 4 on a scale of 10 right now, but we've got to keep an eye on it. I would start worrying about the Strait of Hormuz if tensions escalate further, and that could have cataclysmic effects on the world economy.
Ambassador Robert Jordan, many thanks indeed for talking to